if you listen carefully, you may hear my dog freaking out, which normally happens at about 7:30. So say in about 15 minutes, he'll start trying to batter his way through the door downstairs to come and request seconds for his dinner. But until then, it's all peaceful. So welcome everybody to this, the launch of the 105th issue of Source magazine. Amazing that we have made 105 of these, and everyone is better than the ones that went before it, astonishingly. And this one is about the local. Also within this issue, I draw your attention to the Graduate Photography Online BA supplement, which contains lots of great work from this year's graduating students. Today we're going to talk to two of the contributors to this issue, but first I should thank a few of the people who've helped us to put this event together. This is now the 4th launch I think we've done through Zoom. Maybe some of you have seen them before, and it's been a great format for allowing us to speak to contributors and show some of the workings behind the magazine and get an additional discussion about some of the things that we cover in the issue. But we've, in each case, have hosted these talks with Gallery Photography Ireland. So thank you to them. And of course to our sponsors or our funders, the Arts Council Ireland and Arts Council of Northern Ireland and Belfast City Council. So this issue, as I said, is the local themed issue. We will be it should be available now. If you haven't got a copy already delivered to you in the post, you can get it from our website. Obviously, once you've heard a taste of some of the delicious flavors in this issue. So the portfolios and contents of this issue, I'll draw your attention to a couple of things that we won't be talking about tonight, but which are, I think, worth your attention. There's a great piece by Josh Allen, who, as an aside, I should mention, we first met at the Writers' Prize last year, who has written about the Fix My Street service that local councils offer, where you can send a picture of the local pothole outside your house to your local council, and they will promptly come and fix it. That's the idea anyway. And one of the pleasures of this issue has been finding all of the obsessive people who say, yes, I use that service, it's fantastic. I love sending my council pictures of potholes. So that's a really interesting piece about that. We're going to talk to Ella Ravilious in a second. She's done a wonderful interview with Mark Lawrence, who is in charge of the Oxfordshire History Centre, which you may or may not know has a fantastic photography collection of stuff related to the county of Oxfordshire, obviously. But as we find in the interview, it has a much broader scope than you might expect and brings in many things, and we'll talk to Ella about that a little bit. Also in this issue, 3 great portfolios. And in the review section, which we'll come to in a second, there is the sort of local theme pops up again, but particular of interest to us for tonight, we have a review by Colin Samson in about 2 books about Native American photography. In particular, the first book that I'd come across, Through a Native Lens, American Indian Photography by Nicole Dawn Strathman, which Colin has reviewed, and we're going to talk to Colin about that in a second. Native American photography is not something that we've covered really before in the magazine, as far as I can remember, so it's interesting to open up a whole new area and subject for that. So first of all, I'm going to talk to Ella Ravilious. Ella is a curator at the Victorian Albert Museum. I asked her to talk to Mark Lawrence at the Oxfordshire History Centre because She, as well as being a curator of photography, also has a personal connection to photography archives and local photography. And I wanted to get two different perspectives on this subject. So Ella, if you could unmute yourself, we could chat about that.
Great. Well, I'd like to start by saying thank you for having such a great issue theme. It's been really great to explore some of the things I've been thinking about anyway with this issue. So yeah, it's been a really fun one to be part of.
Yes, as always with these things, we may give the appearance of knowing what we're doing when we start, but we normally end up writing the editorial last, at which point we discover what the issue was about. And that certainly happened with this issue, because local is a very slippery theme, and it has a sort of slightly negative connotations, but also positive associations. And I think people associate it with a kind of closed-mindedness, but that doesn't really need to be what it's about. But maybe if you could tell us a little bit about your connection to this subject before we start looking at some pictures.
Certainly. So my father was a documentary photographer based in North Devon, and his whole career was just focused on this one area. And he was working for a local archive, Beaford Arts, who are still going, to document the people of North Devon. And he built up this colossal body of work, 80,000 negatives, over a sort of 20-year period. And those have now been digitized. The negatives have been digitized and they're online. But also he, as part of that work, he kind of built up the archive even more by borrowing older photographs belonging to the local community and digitizing those. So there's an old archive, what we call the old archive, and the new archive, which is his own work, but the two interrelate because he was often borrowing these photographs from people that he photographed, his sitters, as it were. So we get the same people as children or teenagers showing up in the old archive, and then as mostly quite elderly people in my father's own work. He was working in black and white, mainly. It was certainly all of the archive is black and white. But he graded his work, which is slightly eccentric. And so he graded each photograph, best, good, fair, and poor. And you can see those gradings now on the online catalogue of his work. And that was because he had a sort of dual purpose to it, in that he wanted to make artistic photographs and he wanted to be recognised as a photographic artist, but he also saw the value of the photographs as a documentary record. So sometimes he would include things even though he felt he didn't have the perfect aesthetic photograph of that particular thing, because he felt it was such an important record of, you know, particularly sort of local distinctive events or people or things. So working with this archive now, since his death, and trying to navigate this kind of space between documentary and aesthetics, and what, because I mean, even those terms have changed so much since the 70s and 80s when he was first working, and the value ascribed to documentary photography has really changed in that time. That's much more lumped in with kind of photographic aesthetics now, where he really had.
Maybe we should have a look at some of the pictures. It would help us to. There we go.
So this is quite early work by Dad. This is Bill Smale with his prize-winning onions. And there's a whole strand of photography of village fetes and fruit and veg contests in the archive, which I absolutely adore. And I mean, there is a sort of, in one way, you could see them as a bit nostalgic and a bit sentimental. But for me, I recognize these spaces so much. This is very, these are the people and places I grew up with, and I went to these things, not this one, but this was definitely part of my childhood. So
can you say, do you know how he decided what to photograph?
He would ask people. We lived in this area and were part of the community, and he went to local events and would talk to people and would ask what they were up to, what they were doing, what was happening next week. And he would at first motorbike around the area and see what was going on, and then later would drive around, and he'd have particular people that he'd go and visit time and time again, kind of muses in a way, but also he would just put feelers out and maybe see what events were pinned up on the parish notice board and go and find them. But he was very he would very often focus on the early mornings, and would head out, perhaps do 2 shifts of photography, head out first thing and try and get the kind of landscape shots and weather shots that he wanted to record. And then for the kind of events, he'd sort of follow up with those. One thing that's perhaps a little unusual about the archive is that we've put his contact sheets online. So this is the contact sheet for the photograph you just saw. And I think in exploring the theme of local, that really comes across so much more when you can look at contact sheets. You can really see his day. You can see what a sort of narrative to what he was doing. But also in a lot of them, you can see his annotations and his choices about what he felt was the best photograph in a sequence. So you can see his aesthetic decisions manifest in the contact sheets.
I think this is true on the next one, which contains a couple of famous pictures.
Yeah, and I mean, you certainly see those in the context of a very time-based real event. So you can see perhaps there's 2 on this sheet which are outlined in silver pen, which are his chosen favourites. And one of the things I love about these shots is it's local, but it's not a particular sort of specially Devon thing. It's not a cream tea or a particular breed of cow. It's just how our neighbours were living at that time. And Dad, I mean, I think it's slightly more acceptable these days for photographers to do this, but he was very inspired by painting in his eye, I suppose, his way of choosing photographs. So I know for sure that he will have been thinking about Bruegel paintings for this shot. But also I know both of the people in this shot, and our house was just behind the camera, as it were. So there's a funny mix of quite sort of highbrow concerns in what I think he was thinking about, but also it's so rooted in our lives at that time.
I'd assumed that pulling sheep in tin bathtubs was a kind of special technique. What is that? Are you saying that's a kind of improvised method that you've arrived at there?
It was just a total make do and mend sort of. I mean, these 2 men were smallholders across the valley, and they made use of what was available. I mean, everybody shared equipment. All of the people working in farming, they wouldn't have a full set of, shearing stuff and sheep pens and all the kind of equipment that you have. You would all be borrowing it from each other or taking your flock to circulating it to use these different tools. And if you didn't have anything to hand, you would indeed improvise. So here it's a sort of tin baby bath being used to drag the sick sheep.
I think what you get from the contact sheets, and it's particularly true in this case, is that you have the sudden realization that the subjects must have been aware of that he was setting up a picture, and finding a different way to take a picture, because he's had a number of goes at it. And
yeah, I mean,
under normal circumstances, you might expect somebody to sort of muck in and start pulling the sheep as well. But obviously, they're happy with him there taking a picture.
yeah, I mean, one thing that everyone who was photographed by him remembers is how it was clear that he was taking a photograph, and he would sort of chat to people and ask first, but it was very, very hard to tell at what point he took it. He would be chatting to them, you know, there's clearly a very animated conversation between the photographer and the subject going on here, and he would be moving the camera around, but you wouldn't know, oh right, that's the moment that he's taken a photo of you at all. So they just got very used to him being around, and sort of chatting and being part of it. And I don't know, I mean, perhaps he did stop and help at some point, but yeah, you're right, it's not documented.
So this is the picture that was chosen, and I think this is rated extra good or something.
Yes, yeah.
What is it, do you think, that made him pick certain pictures as being best quality?
Well, he would have been thinking about composition and what he could get out of the negative. He was very, very interested in printing and took a lot of care and effort in that aspect of photography. So he would be sort of trying to find the balance that would get him the best print, but he wouldn't crop. He would try and take the photograph he wanted to take. So, but also, I mean, here, as I say, he will have been thinking about painting, and also artists like Samuel Palmer were a huge influence on him. So he will have been thinking about how this fitted into his aesthetic, as well as documenting something quite funny and quite creative going on with people that we knew well.
What about what about the sort of commitment to documenting local life and practices and things like that? I mean, maybe this is not a specific thing to a specific technique, but I expect there are things like thatching or farming practices that are things that if you were an expert on that, or if you were somebody who wanted to go away and pull sheep yourself, you would be interested to see this as an example. Is that something that you think he was conscious of doing, and how do those pictures fit into the whole corpus?
That's definitely something he was interested in, and even more so something that my mother is interested in. She's the real sort of social local historian. So a lot of his leads would come through her, or she would be helping with the captions and the labels to make sure things were correctly described. And she would be hearing about particular sort of older practices happening, or older equipment being in use, and she would find that and record it. And it's quite, I think, unusual for the archive in how well documented it is. I mean, the subjects are named, we know the date, we know the village, we know what they're doing in much more detail than is usual in an archive. So that's been really helpful. But one thing that's been really nice over recent years is I set up a Twitter account for Dad, for his work, and I was really surprised to find so many kind of niche corners of Twitter who were interested in thatching or hedging, really, really connecting with work. And I thought that was brilliant. I mean, hedging Twitter is massive. Who knew? But they were all discussing the photographs and saying, oh, he's doing this, he's using that. We wouldn't do it like that now. There's kind of a factual richness that they seem to have tapped into, which I think Dad would have been really happy with.
You talked about the old archive previously, and this is a picture from the old archive. Yes,
so this is Reuben Clements, who I don't remember, but was in our village. I think I was a little bit too small to remember him. He was known as quite a figure in the village. He was on the bell ringing team. He played quite a lot of practical jokes and would dress up, as you see here. There's quite a lot of him in the old archive in various costumes or shoeing horses. He was also blacksmith. So he kind of features a lot, and he really looks like quite a sort of dashing, characterful young man. But Dad photographed him in his old age in his own work, and I find it amazing to have this record of this one person at those 2 points in his life. Yeah, I really...
I suppose it's like lots of sort of very long-term documentary projects that you get this sort of richness of seeing the whole scope of someone's experience, and the pathos of seeing them, they're juxtaposed with their young self there as kind of very potent.
Absolutely, and these aren't people who would generally be photographed. It was quite a sort of hidden community in a way. Yeah, they weren't expecting to be documented at all. But Dad would generally give prints of any good photos to the people that he photographed. So hopefully there are still quite a lot of prints by my dad in Devon houses of the people that he worked with.
Something we talked about when we chatted before was about how the pictures circulated in the local community, and you were talking about, when you were talking to Mark, you were talking about the tradition of lantern slides and 35mm slides, and all of which represent a kind of local discussion, the way photography appears in public, but locally. And you picked out this picture here to sort of illustrate that.
Yeah, so this was, I've been working through my dad's colour work, which is all 35mm slides. And I was really pleased to find documentation of an exhibition that he had. He wasn't wildly successful in his lifetime as a photographer. He did have a few shows. The RPS gave him a show. But this was a show of the old archive photographs. So this is photographs that he borrowed from the local community and rephotographed, put on in Hatherley for the Silver Jubilee. And I can see my mum's influence and perhaps handwriting here as well, kind of developing the themes. But there was very much a strand of showing Devon people to themselves, and that came across even more in the slideshows that Mum and Dad used to do. So they would go back to the village halls and put on these events in the evening for people to come to, and it was a real kind of social event. You know, people would be seeing themselves, seeing their friends, kind of joking about what they're doing in photographs, or it would sort of bring forth more memories of what was going on. But I like to think of that as relating to the much earlier tradition of lanternists and lantern slideshows happening in village halls. And I know Dad would have been thinking about that too. I mean, historically, those would have been much more showing people things that they couldn't find, they couldn't access themselves and couldn't see. So, you know, your first and only images of perhaps what the Queen looks like or what other countries are like might have come from magic lantern shows in your village hall. So the way my parents did it is sort of different, because it's very much reflecting the local area back at itself. But it does sort of hark back to that kind of social tradition of photography, which I think we don't explore so much, and a sort of very performative photography. You know, you have the space that you're in, and it's with other people, and you've got the kind of noise of the slides and a narrative. Both with the lanternists and with my parents, they would be giving a whole kind of story to go along with these photographs, so it would be quite performative in that sense. So it's quite a sort of different way of interacting with photography than looking at a framed print on a wall.
Great, thanks very much. So readers, I'm sure you'll enjoy hearing more about or reading more about Ella's father's work, but also it's very interesting to see it counterposed with the Oxfordshire History Centre collection, and so I recommend that interview with it. It's very interesting, and I should mention as well that the range and variety of pictures that Mark has chosen from the Oxfordshire History Centre is excellent. I know, Ella, you were very impressed by those Helen Musrat pictures that that he picked, and there's a couple of his own, one of his own pictures as well in there. So there's plenty to look at there. So Colin, if you could unmute yourself, let me stop the share there. So
hi, I'm unmuted.
Great. So yes, Colin, it's not often that we cover Native American photography. In fact, I don't know that we ever have before. So it was very interesting for me to see this book being put out by this publisher, and then to try and think, who would be the best person to write about it. And the last time I chatted to you, I was asking, what do you think has been the profile of Native American photography in this country up until now?
Yeah. There hasn't been many exhibitions of Native American photography at all in the UK. There was a very good one at the Barbican in 1998. The title of it I forget at the moment, but that was very good because it was a historical survey, and it went from mid 19th century images to contemporary images that were taken by Native American photographers, not just non-native photographers. And there's been a few others at small galleries, and a lot of contemporary Native American artists are kind of installation artists, and they use photography as well as sculptural objects and things like that. I can think of Jimmy Durham, who I actually know, had an exhibition at Matt's Gallery in London not so long ago. So yeah, it is there. It is on the radar at the moment. And as you know, at the Barbican, there's an exhibition of photographs of Yanomami, who are not from the United States but Brazil, and I think that's quite a major exhibition.
Yeah, maybe we'll have a look at some pictures here, because I think it would be good to give a little bit of context to this. Do you find yourself well, I suppose first of all, this is the book that we're talking about, so it's useful to show forget how to do this. It's useful to show the kinds of context for these images, but this is the book we're talking about. A particularly wonderful cover, I think. But when you're talking about Native American photography, this is probably Loom's largest.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a famous image. It was taken by Edward S. Curtis, who is probably the most famous non-native photographer of Native Americans. It was, I think, the last photograph in his 30-volume set called The North American Indian. And it's called Last of Their Race Navajo. And so it's famous because it's often seen as confirming one of the main stereotypes about Native Americans in the 19th century, that they were a vanishing race, that they were, here you see them in this, it's an interesting photograph. Here you see them on horseback, riding into the gloom, riding into sort of some unknown future, but kind of riding out of the picture. And I mean, Curtis was often criticized for simply reaffirming the image of the vanishing Indian, but in a way, I think it's not surprising that he and many other non-native photographers, and there were very few native photographers at that time, there were a few, were depicting images of this kind, because Native Americans had experienced massive population decline from something like 7 to 10 million at the time of the first European invasions, to at this time when Curtis was taken, there's about less than 250,000. The land had been taken away, a lot of the land had been taken away from them. They've been put on reservations. This is taken on the Navajo reservation. The bison had been all but exterminated by Europeans on the Great Plains. So the main source of sustenance and spiritual and a spiritual icon for many of the Great Plains Indians was almost exterminated. And they were also massively depleted by ongoing infectious diseases that were brought by Europeans. Added to that was ideologies like cultural evolutionism and social Darwinism that held that these people were so far inferior to Europeans that they wouldn't be able to survive the competition with whites. But in his defense, what I'd like is that I think that Curtis, what we know about Curtis is that he was very empathic, that he got to know people, he visited them. He, as far as I know, he was quite well liked, which wasn't the case with many other whites that just sort of turned up in Native American communities. And he did seem to have some kind of political desire not to see them simply disappear. And he was like, you know, there was painters that were also doing the same kind of thing. The most famous was George Catlin. And if you read his book by exactly the same title, The North American Indian, you see also that he has immense empathy as well. But you know, you're right. This is a very famous photograph, and it's very famous for the reason that it depicts a vanishing people.
You mentioned this also as a kind of as a benchmark picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a way, this is actually a much clearer representation of a vanishing people. Some of you might have seen this photograph or photographs like this. This was taken by the school photographer at the Carlisle Indian Boarding School, which was set up in 1879 by Captain Lewis Henry Pratt. The motto of the school was from savagery to civilization, kill the Indian to save the man. And the idea was that these boarding schools, which Native Americans were often forcibly sent to, would act as instruments to exterminate the indigenous culture and replace that with a kind of Anglo-American culture. So what you see here in these photographs, which I think were taken in the 1880s, is a group of Chiricahua Apaches. So they would have come from originally the US-Mexico border in Arizona, not far from actually where my family migrated when I was 12 years old. And these people here were actually prisoners of war. So a lot of the images that were taken by Nicholas Choate, the school photographer at Carlisle, were of children that were actually prisoners of war. So those the people in that image on the left had just arrived, not from their homelands in Arizona, they just arrived from Fort Marion prison in Florida, because they were part of the band that Geronimo led. And Geronimo, of course, was one of the Native Americans that really held out against European dominance or American dominance, and eventually was captured in northern Mexico. So they were brought there, and then within, I don't know how much longer, a few weeks later, Choate produced another photograph that shows that the hair is being cut, they're Their clothing has been changed into European school uniforms, and they look very unhappy. I think they look very unhappy. And actually, these two images were featured at the show that was at the Barbican in 1998. And I remember talking to Jolene Rickard, who is a Native American art critic, and she was an artist at one time. And I remember her saying that like this was the saddest photograph that she encountered in the whole exhibition. But there are many of these, and often the image of the before image, you could see kind of all kinds of regalia, all kinds of beautiful, jewelry that were on the children that was that then disappeared in the subsequent photograph.
I mean, we've given us a sort of introduction, but it's sort of overwhelmingly negative. So maybe we're talking about the book now. These are illustrations from the book. It's something that can count as a counterpoint to that negative picture. And you started by talking about Richard Throssell.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's not all negative, and I like these for a couple of reasons. One is that about 5 years ago, I spent 2 semesters as a visiting professor at the American Indian Studies Center at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, Wyoming. And Throssell's entire archive is held by the University of Wyoming Art Museum. So I actually went to see quite a lot of them myself. And Throssell is very interesting because he's, on one side, I think his mother was Cree Indian. So that's from northern Canada. And his father was English. They ended up in Seattle for various reasons. And then he started getting interested in photography and moved eastward into Montana and Wyoming. And he started living with the Crow and Cheyenne and taking up photography. And so almost all of his photographs are of Crow or Cheyenne people mostly in Montana. And I like them because, unlike, say, a lot of the non-native photographers, what Curtis tended to do is show native people doing native things. So these are just a couple here, but if you look at his whole archive, there's tons of ones like, people hunting rabbits, or people swimming in a lake, people sharing some tobacco or something. But they seem to be very spontaneous. They don't seem to be set up, although I'm sure there was probably some element of it. So you see, like the photograph there on the left, I've got a copy of it in the book here, which the book, by the way, is great. I think this is a really good book. I've read quite a lot of books on Native American and photography, and I think this is one of the best. And Nicole Strathman is a young art historian, I think, at UCLA. So the one on the left, you can see the teepee, you can see the man. Let me just have a look at it myself. You can see the man with the holding a child, I think, and you can see people, but you can see them from the back. So Throssell didn't try to get up in their faces or anything. It's sort of from a respectful distance. The one on the right is 2 kids with puppies. But it's interesting also that they've got, and the Nicole Strathman points this out, they've got elk's teeth beading, in their clothing, which was very important for the Great Plains, Indians of the Great Plains. And the one at the bottom is just a beautiful one. It just seems like he's coming into the tent, and the woman looks up and kind of gives him a nice look, but you can see that he's friends with the people. So I think his work is quite different than Curtis, who actually trained him. So Curtis he did meet Curtis, and Curtis gave him some tips on taking photographs. But I quite admire his work.
So this is a picture of somebody who's a Native American photographer who set up a studio called Benjamin Haldane.
That's right. Yeah. Sorry, what page is that? 83, is it?
Yeah.
Sorry to detain you with this. I just wanted to remind myself of it. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I know a little bit less about this particular photographer who was from the northwest coast, but I mean, I like this photograph, and I think the author included it in there because it shows a Native American person as a photographer in their studio with their equipment, with the little box of slides, with the camera there. You know, everything is all set up. They've posed themselves in there, and this certainly is a complete counterpoint to the idea of the vanishing Indian. So you have the the native person there actually as the photographer. And today, of course, there are numerous Native American photographers. But the one great virtue, one of the many virtues of this book is that it showcases several Native American photographers, including George Johnston. I don't know if you wanted to speak about him.
Oops. I suppose there's a question behind this is whether the question of whether it makes any difference talking about the perspective of a Native American photographer as against a sort of non-Native American photographer. This is something you discuss in the review. What is it that distinguishes the Native American photographer from the person who's photographing, as it were, from the outside?
Yeah, well, mostly, I think all of the Native American photographers that are featured in the book are people that came from a particular community. So that they know the community. Is a bit like Ella's father. he was immersed in that community, and so I think there's kind of more warmth in those photographs, and I think there is more of a tendency to be respectful rather than being rude, and a lot of whites simply just assumed that they were superior, that their technologies were superior, that the native people would be wowed by all their gadgets and things like that, and that the native people should just succumb to whatever they wanted to have done. And as a result, a lot of the images that are taken by the non-native photographers are kind of stiff. At least the portraits seem very, very stiff, whereas I don't think they do with many of the non-native photographers. I think that's one of the main differences, and also they're more likely to place the people in the images in a natural context rather than a fake context.
What do these pictures show?
Okay, this is George Johnson, who is Tlingit from the Yukon. The Tlingit people also go over to Alaska as well. And the image on the left is a potlatch, and the potlatch was a ceremony in which occurred every once in a while in various Northwest Coast communities, the object of which was to redistribute wealth. So the idea was that when these ceremonies were called, people would give away as much as they could. Here, what you see is clothing being given away, and I think there was a special kind of ceremony that was just for giving away clothing. And I can't see the date. Is that 1942? Yeah, I think that was about the time that the Canadian government banned it. So that they saw it as so outrageous. It was so contrary to the principles of the profit motive and capitalism that it was banned, and it was also suppressed in the US, but it was actively banned in Canada. So in a way, this is quite a subversive photograph on the left. But that I'm not sure at that time if that was against the law, but it was for a period of time in Canada. And on the right, sorry, on the right, did you want me to say anything more about the?
Yeah. Are these two pictures connected, or are they?
Good question. I don't think they. I think they're connected in that I think they're the same peoples. They're the same group. It's the same community. And the one on the right is, of course, a funeral. And again, here, this is what I would say would be the difference between a native and a non-native photographer. The native photographer here, George Johnston, respectfully stands behind them. You know, so the mourners are there, and they're there, and he's there behind them. And the author draws attention to the fact that up until really the mid-19th century, sorry, the mid-20th century, native people were still coming down in huge numbers and dying in huge numbers from European diseases. And she, as she says, that she went to this community and she interviewed some people. That's what's so good about the book as well, and also the other book I reviewed, is that both of the authors actually went to some of the communities and they interviewed people. And she says that there were instances where children, and photographs where children were playing being at a funeral, because funerals were so common, because so many people were dying from these infectious diseases, that the children simply just, it was something that the children picked up around them and reenacted, as it were. I would also say, like, this is similar to me, in my mind, to some photographs that Richard Throssell took of the Sundance. And as you and some of the audience might know, the Sundance is, you know, a sacred ceremony of the Great Plains Indians. And Throssell took those photographs from a really long distance. So you can see the lodge poles, you can see people perhaps dancing or walking around the lodge poles, but you can't really see much of what's happening. You just know that it's a Sundance. But the image itself is enough. You don't need to actually really have a close-up of what's there, especially if you want to maintain respect for something that's really sacred.
Something that comes across, maybe even by the very existence of this book, is the question of where this material resides, and what is, if somebody wants to explore the history of Native American photography, where do they go to find out about it?
Yeah, good question. Lots of different books, lots of different archives. I mean, that's a good. I mean, in North America, a lot of these photographs are in state and county collections. They're in art museum collections. The Smithsonian obviously has a ton of them. But now a lot of the collections a lot of the photographs that were taken by Native American photographers are in the communities themselves. So I'm pretty sure that Nicole Strathman went to a place, I think, called Teslin in the Tlingit community in the Yukon, and there was a little museum there where these images, where these photographs are held. But a lot of Native communities don't have anything like this. They don't have photographers of like George Johnston. In fact, many of them have none, or have had very few until really, really recently. So I think they're all over the place. But you know, interestingly, a lot of them are in local collections. So you have to go to the local places to find them.
Is this the best place to start if somebody wanted to find out more about the subjects, and how much literature is there? I mean, you referred to various other books that have been written about this subject, and probably on a narrower scale.
Yeah, I think this is a good book to start with. It's so wonderfully produced. It's got images on almost every single page, and it features people that aren't really that well known. The other part of the book, which we really haven't spoken about very much, is there's a whole part about Native Americans as participants you know, in photography of photographs by non-native photographers. But I find the second part, this one, much more interesting because she profiles a number of artists who haven't really had, I'd never heard of I'd never heard of Halbane, I'd never heard of Johnston before I got this book. But you know, there are a lot of books. There are a lot of writers, I would say. I like Gerald Vizenor, who I know, but I quoted Gerald, who's Ojibwe or Anishinaabe from Minnesota. And he's very critical about photography, but he also is quite interested in it too. There's lots of general books, but this is actually a good place to. I think this is a very good place to start. I think I mentioned the book by James Farris, whose book, The Navajo and Photography, is very good, and I think his work is good. James Farris is actually the husband of Lucy Lippard. Some of you might know who she's quite a well-known American art critic, art historian. So yeah, there's many places to start, but this is as good as any, I would say.
Great, thanks very much. So I'll stop sharing that. So thank you very much, Colin. That's fascinating to learn a bit more about that. I think maybe we could throw this out. We have a few minutes left if anybody wanted to ask any questions. Got two incredibly well-informed people here, and I can tell you about postage rates if you want to ask me a question. But if you want to know something more interesting, then this would be a good opportunity. You can either put up your hand if you want to ask a question, or if you write in the chat section, then we can see if anybody has a question. It was just while we're seeing if there's anybody want to chip in there. There was one thing you mentioned, Colin, in the review, was that that there are some parts of what you might call Native American photography. I mean, it's a bit of a loose term. That, I mean, is that the term that you would use yourself?
Probably, yeah. I mean, I would distinguish, between photographs taken by Native Americans or indigenous people. I mean, if you think about terminology, or American Indians. I mean, I was in the American Indian Studies department at the University of Wyoming, where most of the students were Arapaho and Shoshone. So they had no problem or issue with using American Indian. So is that what you're, so I would...
Well, I was sort of mentioning this as a kind of prelude to saying that there were some things that you said were sort of missed, especially talking about the photographs made in the Arctic, or I suppose probably also going down to Mexico and to Central and South America. Yeah,
well, it's hard to be comprehensive, and you know, it's uncharitable for me to pick holes in that book, but there is a rich tradition of northern photography, far northern photography. I know this because I've spent 25 years working with the Innu in northern Labrador and northern Quebec, and but the Inuit even further north in the Arctic have many quite famous photographers, well, not famous, but they're known, I suppose, in Canada, and also filmmaking tradition. Some of you might have seen The Fast Runner at the Najut, it's called in Inuktitut. And there's a whole production company called Iglulik Izuma Productions, which is on Baffin Island. So yeah, there is a rich tradition, and as soon as Inuit were exposed to photography, they started trying to do it. You know, they even went to nursing stations and found the chemicals that you need to try to develop photographs. And there's a quite an interesting book, strange book by Peter Pitsulak, which is called People from Our Side, which I mentioned in the review, but there's many others. So maybe she missed that out a bit. And also maybe it is artificial just to see indigenous photography according to the nation state that colonized them. So, so just to talk about American or Canadian or whatever, is to miss the fact that there's a unity of all the people. Where I lived in Arizona, many of the people, indigenous people, spoke Uto-Aztecan languages, which go all the way down to southern Mexico. So yeah, I mean, I think there is a role for making this, more hemispheric, and not being overly deferential to the state, to the nation state.
Great, thank you. So yes, I wonder if I can see if anybody's wanted to chip in there, but I suppose that just to follow up from that point, if anyone wants to ask a question, then they can put up their hand virtually or write it in the chat section. But just as a sort of follow-up question to that, you can't help wondering, over such an enormous geographic landmass, whether it makes sense to talk about different people who maybe never had any contact with one another, all within one category. I mean, does it make sense to say that?
Well, it only makes sense insofar as the people under that rubric are people that whose occupancy predates Europeans. So they're indigenous. I think the word indigenous is probably better. Indigenous peoples, and of course they are massively different. The Navajo are very different than the people in the Great Plains. The people in the north are woodland people. Some are hunters, some are farmers, some are pastoralists, some had military traditions, most did not. There are a few unifying features. I mean, one is that usually a commitment to egalitarianism, and also to what's sometimes called egalitarian individualism, respect for the autonomy of the person, which comes back to the photography. So the native photographers were much more mindful of the need to respect people's autonomy and their independence.
Yeah. So Stuart has asked a question here. I think this is for Ella. I don't know, Stuart, would you like to turn on your microphone and ask Ella what you're saying, rather than us reading? I suppose that the gist of it, maybe for Ella, for you, is can you anticipate there being an equivalent project to your father's for this year? Do you think there are people doing work like your father was doing now?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of younger photographers who are looking at kind of local communities, including, I mean, you showcase some in the magazine, some brilliant work in Wales by Mohammed Hassan. And I think the pandemic has certainly brought that out even more. I've seen a lot of kind of pandemic photography aggregation projects, as well as solo photographer kind of projects. So I think those kind of bodies of work might become increasingly useful to describe our current era, and those will have been quite documented in a way that historians in future will be able to find them and will be able to kind of, they will have the keywords that will help us connect to that body of work. So I think there's a lot that is being recorded now. And sorry, I've just seen the other question come through. Yes. Thank you, Tana. So about advice on archiving images. And I think this would be with my V&A hat on. I'll answer that one. I would say that sometimes the order and the structure is important to think about, as well as the individual works. So it can be tempting to kind of go in and fish out the best photographs, but it's having that understanding before you start of the kind of physical context they sit in. You know, what photograph is before them or after them in the box helps understand that particular photograph. And sometimes at the V&A, that's almost all that we have to go on to try and figure out the story of a particular photograph. And I would also say start very, very basic, and try and do very, very basic things to everything, rather than really, really, really detailed work that isn't sustainable and that you stop halfway through. And if you are thinking of perhaps one day the archive going to a museum or a heritage organisation, or perhaps being put online, the metadata and the structures of the metadata are really important. And that can be not just sort of as much detail as possible, but understanding ways of entering that data that's quite standardized, or a mix of standardized and not standardized, so that things are searchable and you can, like, people who don't already know the archive can navigate it. I've also
there's actually just to mention to in relation to what you're talking about, there's a very nice example of that in the magazine, because we have a section in the portfolios of pictures from the Joe McGarrigle archive, and he was a press photographer, and we've gone through the same process, and his family are going through the same process of trying to make his work accessible, and that has very much depended on things like the captioning on the photographs that were there for when the pictures were taken, without which they would be pretty much unintelligible, I suppose.
Yeah, that's hugely useful, and such a boon with working with press photographs that you do have that. But even things like to a curator, things like the handwriting that a caption is written in on the back of a photograph can help us figure out what's going on with them. I mean, sometimes we'll get things and we really don't know very much about them at all, but we can start to piece together, oh, you know, all of these have the same handwriting on the back, or all of these have the same stamp, and you can start to sort of follow this detective work. I would say as well, one thing that I feel quite strongly is our notion of what a boring photograph is really, really changes over time. That's certainly true of my work. When I first started at the museum, I was tempted to ship off a load of photographs to a remote store, because I thought, well, nobody is looking at these. What on earth are they for? You know, nobody's using them, and they're quite sort of dusty and fusty. And now they're the subject of my PhD. But I think in terms of kind of photographs of local life and local history, if they're beyond a certain age, even if they're not very good photographs, there might be other values within them in terms of what's in the photograph and what's happening that are so important that it's worth keeping, even though aesthetically it's not the greatest. And that just increases over time. So yeah, I think an expanded view of what is and isn't a boring photograph is a good way to approach things.
Great. Thanks very much. Well, I think we'll draw to a close there. In summary, if you want to learn more about these subjects, the magazine is now available in good shops and via the Source website. Thank you very much to Colin and Ella. You can read more of their thoughts in the magazine, and thank you for your inspiring talks. And And I look forward to doing this again for the next issue, but it will be surely an impossible task to surmount what we have achieved in the local issue. Thank you very much, and we'll see you at a bookshop, gallery, or at a special event for photography in the coming months, but if not, at the next launch.